welcome to our live session called Ag Gag, What's at Stake? My name is Barbara Cartwright and I am the CEO of Humane Canada and honored to moderate this session with three exceptional panelists, legal and academic experts, who are going to explore the different aspects of this type of legislation and help you get a better understanding of the facets of the law or the bills that might propose it. The term Ag Gag has come to represent a host of different kinds of laws enacted to restrict actions of animal activists on farm. Initiated in the United States, similar bills have started to make their journey into Canadian law. This discussion, the concerns, the criticisms of Ag Gag legislation is not new. But what is new is a shift in perspective in Canada. In the early 2010s, the discussion was really about what was happening in another country. It was more theoretical. And Canadian agriculture was openly against Ag Gag laws in our country. In fact, back in October 13, Better Farming, an industry paper, ran a story titled Ontario's Livestock Industry, No Fan of Ag Gag Laws, which highlighted representatives from Ontario's agriculture sector saying that enacting similar laws in Canada would be ineffective and run contrary to the industry's commitment to transparency. Canadian agriculture, they said, should be both farmer and public friendly. Fast forward to 2019, where we now have two such bills moving through provincial parliament and debate in our federal parliament on the merits of such laws. The legislation has reignited the debate, and this time it's about our laws and about our challenges in Canada. That can make for difficult conversation, but this panel is designed to provide you with basic information, research and analysis, as well as an opportunity to ask your questions of these experts. To orient you to the session, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, who will then take us through about a 10-minute presentation of each of their own. To begin, we'll hear from Kevin Toyne and his presentation called Ag Gag 101, an introduction to American Ag Gag law. Then, Dr. Nina von Keyserling will take us through the research that the University of British Columbia has been doing into the effects of Ag Gag. And finally, Camille Lapchuk will share with us what is happening with the Ag Gag laws in Canada today. Once that's complete, the panel will be taking your questions. So please put your questions into the public chat box on the right of the screen, and we will look to answer some of those questions in about the last 20 minutes of the session. So I would like to start by introducing Kevin Toyne, an experienced civil litigation lawyer from Winnipeg, and his practice also includes the growing field of animal law. In 2014-2015, he served as the vice chair of the Animal Law section of Ontario Bar Association. He currently serves on the board of directors of Humane Canada and the Winnipeg Humane Society. He teaches civil procedure at Robson Hall Law School at the University of Manitoba, and in 2017, he obtained his Master's of Laws from Osgoode Hall at York University. He has both represented whistleblowers and those that have been trespassed against. Dr. Nina von Keyserling is a professor at the University of British Columbia, where she co-directs the Animal Welfare Program. Together with her colleagues and students, their research focuses on assessing animal welfare and developing practical methods of improving the welfare of animals. She has published hundreds of scientific papers and is a frequent and enthusiastic speaker for academic and professional audiences. Nina was co-author on a research article titled Awareness of Ag Gag Laws Erodes Trust in Farmers and Increases Support for Animal Welfare Regulations. And our final panelist is Camille Lapchuk, a Toronto-based animal rights lawyer and the executive director of Animal Justice. Under her leadership, Animal Justice fights legal cases in courtrooms across the country, works to promote and pass groundbreaking new animal protection legislation, and ensures laws already on the books are being enforced. Camille has intervened in precedent-setting cases to protect and enhance animals' legal interests at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. She is a frequent lecturer on animal law and is currently working with a coalition of lawyers looking at the Ag Gag laws/bills in both Alberta and Ontario. Before we begin, I want to share with you that I've received some questions about why there isn't a panelist representing the perspective of agriculture. And I agree, it would have been excellent to have someone on the panel to speak to that perspective. We did invite both farmers and those who represent or work more closely with farmers to join us, but for many reasons, it didn't work out that way. We also approached the government officials that are looking at this type of legislation to get their perspective, but they were unavailable. I am pleased to see many different agriculture groups with us today, and I hope they will ask questions or even provide us with their thoughts as the session unfolds by using that chat box on the right-hand side. As our parliamentary panel highlighted yesterday, we need to find common ground and all are welcome. Remember, ask your questions. Let's begin. Kevin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Barb, and good afternoon, everybody. So I'll be talking about American Ag Gag laws and legal decisions to help give everyone a better understanding and to help inform your discussions about what's at stake with Canadian Ag Gag. So I'll start off talking about the concept of Ag Gag, the purpose of Ag Gag, the effects that it's had. I'll give you a couple of examples from 2 states. I'll talk briefly about some of the legal challenges that have been largely but not entirely successful in the US. And then I'll try to bring it all together to help explain how that might influence Ag Gag here at home in Canada. So much like Canada, the American government, both federal and state, has provided different types of supports to the agricultural industry for a very long time. And those supports can take a number of different shapes: tax support, subsidies, quotas, tariff protection. And in that sense, Ag Gag is another form of governmental support for the agricultural industry. But unlike those other supports, Ag Gag has a very different impact and a very different focus. And as Barb said at the outset, Ag Gag legislation in the US really began a number of decades ago when different animal rights organizations and activists began doing undercover exposés and investigations. And those investigations, exposés, and the information that they brought into the public realm started to have some fairly serious economic impacts on those involved in farmed animal agriculture. And in one of the legal decisions that talks about this, it talks about those types of economic harms being quite serious. And that's what really led a number of these states to start introducing what's now called Ag Gag legislation. Now, Ag Gag legislation has 2, at least in theory, purposes that are typically talked about by the proponents of Ag Gag legislation in the US. And in this particular legal decision that's up on the screen, one of those purposes is called facility security. So biosecurity and simple protection of private property. But the other purpose is attempting to address either proactively or reactively the harms that can accompany investigative reporting and the dissemination of information from investigative reporting to the general public. Now, that's really at the high level what the purpose of Ag Gag is. The proponents of Ag Gag in the different state legislatures where this has been passed tend to be a little bit more direct in what they say the purpose of Ag Gag is. So in this decision out of Idaho, there was a reference to silencing animal activists. In another decision, it's about exposing the real agenda of these radical groups that are engaging in farm terrorism. Now, that's not a phrase that we hear often in Canada. The US tends to use much stronger language to describe these things, but there's no doubt that people who support Ag Gag, whatever side of the border you're on, feel that those engaged in the conduct that it's intended to prevent are engaging in unlawful or criminal activity. A sponsor of Ag Gag in one state senate, a fellow named David Hinkins, talked about Ag Gag being meant to address vegetarian people that are trying to kill the animal industry. So whether we're talking about animal rights activists or a broader group of people, the real focus is dealing with those who fundamentally disagree with various agricultural practices and are attempting to improve animal welfare. Now, the effect of Ag Gag in the US has, at least as set out in this decision, is to suppress speech by undercover investigators and whistleblowers, not just about animal welfare issues, other issues that are related to the operation of farmed animal agricultural facilities, food safety, worker safety, environmental welfare. All four of those topics are things that can be affected by the presence of Ag Gag legislation. And in this particular decision, a case called Otter, the court talks about the public interest in those four issues: food safety, worker safety, animal welfare, environmental protection, and how it's not appropriate in the American constitutional system to give these heavily regulated facilities additional protection from scrutiny given the public interest in their operations. So what does Ag Gag look like in the US? Well, in the state of Idaho, interference with agricultural production became a crime. And it was a crime that was really intended to do two things. First, to prevent individuals from gaining unauthorized access to agricultural production facilities, primarily through misrepresentation. Other phrases can be false pretense, so-called dishonest access, but also to prevent those who gain that access from gaining access to records or from creating recordings that can then be shared. So you prevent access that's unauthorized, and you prevent the dissemination of information when that information's collection has also not been authorized. That's really the focus of the legislation in some states where there's Ag Gag. In other states like Iowa's first iteration of Ag Gag, the focus was really more on the unlawful or unauthorized access, and they called it agricultural production facility fraud. So very focused on preventing unauthorized access. So whether it's false pretenses, misrepresentation, dishonest access, that all goes back to that very first primary purpose of Ag Gag, which is if you are preventing access, you are preventing access to information, preventing dissemination of information, and preventing scrutiny and discussion in the broader public realm. As I said at the outset, there have been a number of legal challenges in the US that have been largely, but by no means entirely successful, and they've primarily focused on challenging the legislation under the American First Amendment, which protects speech. So in the state of Idaho, the Ag Gag legislation that was challenged was found to be unconstitutional. That was reversed in part on appeal. In the state of Utah, the Ag Gag legislation was found to be unconstitutional. The state of Iowa, also unconstitutional. An appeal is pending of that decision. The state of Iowa didn't wait for the legal process to play out. They introduced a second version of Ag Gag. There's a further legal challenge of that. In the state of Arkansas, the legal challenge was dismissed at the outset, and there's an appeal in that state. And finally, in the state of Kansas, the Ag Gag law was found to be partially constitutional and partially unconstitutional. So what on earth does all of that mean for us here in Canada? Well, Canadian Ag Gag is certainly influenced, if not based on American Ag Gag, but it's important to remember that there are differences between our two systems. Rights are protected in Canada under our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is different from the American Bill of Rights. So rights in the two countries can receive varying levels of protection. The levels of government in the two countries have different powers and authorities. So things that American states can do, Canadian provinces may not be able to do that. So we can't simply cut and paste American Ag Gag into Canada. It doesn't work. So American Ag Gag can't be something that we just import without, whether it's our politicians or the judges, modifying or refining anything that might be constitutional. So speaking of constitutional, there's similar types of legislation that have been introduced in both countries that are intended to protect abortion clinics and those that provide abortion and other types of reproductive health services. They're often referred to as access zones, bubble zones, and those types of protections have been found in Canada to be constitutional. So there's a case in British Columbia where that type of legislation in the abortion context was found to be constitutional. Those governments that are advancing Ag Gag will tend to point to that other type of legislation and say, well, if it works in the abortion context, it should also work in the agricultural context. It remains to be seen how that plays out in Canada. But given all of the legal challenges in the US, I suspect we'll really see a focus on things that are found to be constitutional: trespass, prevention of damage, the unauthorized access through false pretenses, and giving those that operate these facilities the right to try to recover damages from those that are causing them harm. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. That was a great introduction, and I love the link into Canada and what we might be seeing here in Canada, and look forward to hearing more from Camille on what is going on right now today in Canada. Right now, I'd like to turn the floor over to Nina to talk to us a little bit about the research that UBC has been doing with regards to the impacts of Ag Gag legislation in the United States. Nina?
Just making it big here. All right, thank you, Barbara. Hopefully everybody can see that fine. So I just wanted to thank Humane Canada for actually taking on the challenge of trying to increase the awareness about what Ag Gag laws are. And I just want to say at the outset, I am not an expert. I am glad that I have my two colleagues on the committee who I believe are, when it comes to the legal side of this, far, far more, have a much greater knowledge than I do. Before I start into the paper, the research that we did, I just want to give a little bit of background. In our case, or in my case here, I had a PhD student who was here, who was from the US, who had worked for a dairy organization for 8 years as a staff person. And around sort of 2008, 2009, 2010, sort of when the Ag Gag laws were really starting to percolate up, not only in discussions in the ag sector, but it was also something that you were seeing a lot in the media. And so Jesse, who's the first author on the paper, came to me and said, look, I would love to do some research where we actually see, what does this actually mean in terms of trust? You know, the agriculture is such an important sector of society. And we see that now too, with all the challenges with the supply chains and all this with the COVID issue, the pandemic right now. And so we started down this journey of figuring out a way of trying to see whether or not we could get a feel for what the implementation of such a law would do in terms of the public and the public trust in agriculture. So that is really what ended up as the beginning of this. And, you know, in essence, as an animal welfare scientist, I'm really interested in the social license, and that, you know, it is society that gives agriculture the social license to produce food. And ultimately, I think, you know, for agriculture to succeed, we also need to maintain that social license. And hence, you know, all of the work that I'm doing in animal welfare is, and I work with many, many different agriculture organizations, is trying to improve the lives of animals, which I think is a central tenet to maintaining social license. But essentially, to me, you know, knowing very little about this was the this issue of the Ag Gag, in some ways, just simply speaking, was just closing the barn doors and not letting anybody in. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it to some degrees, but that's really what we were trying to assess. Was there a cost to doing so? And, you know, as my colleague said now, you know, and I've just made it very simple here. So in terms of the Ag Gag laws, you're essentially prohibiting the outflow of information from the farms. So prohibit the taking or possessing of photographs, videos, or audio recordings on farms without consent. And then, we see a lot of organizations then using those video recordings and then uploading them on the internet. Is that something that I condone? Absolutely not. I mean, I don't think it's, hopefully we could have conversations to avoid that. But agriculture reacted in many cases and went through the legal framework. And as, Kevin said, many states, have implemented these Ag Gag laws. And I remember being in Ontario in sort of 2010, and I remember seeing an agriculture newspaper where they said, Canada doesn't condone the Ag Gag laws. And it really is, in some ways, surprising that now, a decade later, here we are again. But anyhow, Jesse went down this path. So we were interested ultimately in whether or not there was counterproductive effects of reduced transparency, because really that to me is simply said what the Ag Gags laws are doing is that their farms in some ways are saying, I don't want to be as transparent as I was before. I want to control that message. And again, I see why some people want to hold on to that. But again, we were really interested in whether or not this would come at a cost greater than maybe agriculture is willing to pay at this time. So we were interested in the awareness of Ag Gag laws. Would it reduce the credibility of farmers and the perceptions of farm animal well-being? I normally never use the word well-being. I always use the word welfare, but please remember this was in the context of the United States. The United States, in generally speaking, has been very, very hesitant to use the word welfare. They tend to use the word well-being a lot more. I think there's connotations with human welfare, whatever. That was the reason that we ended up using the word animal well-being here. So what we did is we used Amazon Prime, which in 2012, I think, or 13, when we did this study, was very big in the US. And it is now, of course, a huge thing now worldwide. But Amazon has a part to it through Amazon Prime called Amazon Mechanical Turk, which allows people just, if they're bored, they can go on there and do surveys. So we recruited through Amazon Mechanical Turk. We recruited 716 Americans, actually 750 Americans, but then we have an attention check, which, people just go through and don't read it and just tick boxes. We have a way of censoring the data for that. And these individuals, we got all their demographics, where they lived, suburban, urban, rural, income. We asked them their political affiliation, their age, all that kind of stuff. They were randomly assigned to 2 treatments, and I'll tell you about those 2 treatments in a second. But then also what we did is we used a previously validated inventory which assessed public trust assessed trust in farmers. We got this from the literature. You can go to the paper if you want more details about this, but this was something that had been previously validated in the literature. The 2 treatments were quite simple. People entered the survey, and what happened is they were either put into the Ag Gag treatment, where we just told them about the law. We didn't use the word Ag Gag. We just told them about that some states were doing this. These were sort of the facts behind it, and we gave them some information on sort of the opponents and proponents of that type of legislation. And then the control treatment was just simply about hay, and we just balanced it sort of for cognitive ability, for sort of the number of spaces, the number of words, all that kind of stuff. And then we asked them all these questions, and then we looked at trust. So what happened? Ag Gag legislation basically negatively impacted the perceived credibility of farmers and perceptions of farm animal well-being. So here I have on the y-axis, I have the trust scale that went from basically 1 to 7. The control group were those people that were told about hay, and then the law group were those that were told about the Ag Gag law. So Ag Gag law. So here you see that we saw this reduction in trust as soon as people found out about the law. And it tracked really nicely because we had all the demographics about them. We saw that people that were omnivores, so both meat eating and diverse diets, those that were the control had more trust than those that were in the law group, and the same with the vegetarian group. And interesting, we would predict that vegetarians have less trust in farm animal well-being in the United States than those that eat meat, right? The same as place of residence. We would expect that people living in rural areas are more trusting of farmers than those that live in urban areas. But again, those that were told about hay were more trusting than those that were told about the law. When we asked participants about whether or not, then we had a bunch of questions in the trust survey aspect where we asked participants whether or not they thought farmers were trustworthy sources of information. And again, you can see those that were exposed to information about the Ag Gag law were much less trusting than those that received information about hay. We saw the same thing when we asked them about factual information about animal welfare. Again, as soon as they felt that farmers were trying to hide something, they were less trusting of them. And lastly, I think this is a bit unfortunate, but just generally speaking, we see that, do people, when asked, do farm animals have good lives? Even the control group, we were less than 50%. But again, the take-home message here is that those that were exposed to information about the law were much less trusting. So my take-home point was that at least our research showed that closing the barn doors erodes public trust in farmers and increases support for animal welfare regulation. Over to you.
Thank you, Nina. What a succinct walk through a complex paper. I really appreciate how simple and clear that was. So thank you very much for providing that information to us. And now I'd like to turn the mic, quote unquote, over to Camille to talk to us about Ag Gag today in Canada.
Let me just get my slides up here. Okay, I'm going to drill down a little bit more into the specifics of the Canadian context and what we've seen over the last 6 months or so. We've really seen the emergence of Ag Gag laws in Canada. So we're going to go through where they came from and why the context is actually quite different from the United States. There we go. So undercover investigations in Canada are not something new. In fact, they started really in earnest in about 2012 when Mercy for Animals came to Canada. They are formerly a US-based organization. But they started doing undercover investigations of factory farms in Canada starting in 2012. They exposed cruelty inside pig barns, inside chicken farms, egg farms, veal business, slaughterhouses. They've done over a dozen undercover investigations now in Canada. As you can see, many of these received quite high media exposure. Many of them were released on W5. And I would say that the footage revealed from those investigations was stomach churning. The animal cruelty was shocking, and it was a moment for Canadians to really peel back the curtain and see what's happening behind the closed doors of barns. Now, it's not just Mercy for Animals and it's not just farms that have been investigated. There's also been zoos that have been hit with undercover investigations revealing shocking beatings of animals, whippings of tigers. An Ontario mink farm was charged with animal cruelty after an undercover investigation by Last Chance for Animals. Footage came out from Marineland, and there was quite a high-profile investigation as well of a lab in Montreal that revealed pretty disturbing images of abuse done to monkeys and dogs and pigs. The impact of these investigations has also been significant. We've seen countless sets of animal cruelty charges laid against farms, against zoos, and even some convictions. There's also been policy changes that have likely been spurred by the footage revealed inside those investigations, such as the National Farm to Animal Care Council, putting out a policy that farmers should abandon battery cages by 2036. So they have had an impact on the Canadian landscape, certainly the legal landscape, and definitely the way public perceives farming. Barb spoke about this in the intro, so I won't dwell on it, but at the time that these investigations started coming out in Canada, the industry said that it was not a fan of Ag Gag laws and had no intention of pursuing them here. I'm not so sure that that was ever the case, which we'll sort of get to in a few moments, because I think what we're now seeing is evidence that there was perhaps a desire for shutting down the conversation about what's happening on farms all along. So the undercover investigations were nothing new. That had been happening for quite some time. What is new and what's allegedly sparked the rise of Ag Gag laws now in Canada is more recent incidents that are less about undercover investigations and more about other conditions involving transport trucks and farm trespass. So I'm showing you an image here of an article from the Globe and Mail about the acquittal of a woman named Anita Crines. Many of you will recognize this image. Anita is founder of an organization called the Save Movement, which does vigils outside slaughterhouses. And there's a truck in this image. You can see that Anita is providing water to a pig in that truck. In 2015, she was charged with the criminal offense of mischief for doing such an act. The allegation was that she'd interfered with the property of a farmer, to wit the pigs, by giving them water. She was acquitted after a much publicized trial that made headlines around the world. And the farm industry was none too happy about that fact. I think they shot themselves in the foot by pushing to prosecute her, because the slogan, "Compassion is not a crime," became the rallying cry for Anita Crines and for her supporters. Other incidents as well involving activists doing nighttime visits of farms have resulted in charges. So it is an offense, a provincial offense in all provinces, to trespass onto property without permission. This is a woman named Jenny McQueen who had charges dropped against her after an alleged trespass incident in a pig farm in Ontario. She revealed some pretty disturbing images there as well. Photo here of a man who was involved in walking onto several mink farms in Ontario at night, and he gathered footage that would shock you of minks with open festering wounds, living in filthy conditions, very, very disturbing footage. The footage was publicized, and he was eventually prosecuted in a couple of different areas. Some of those charges are pending, but no criminal convictions for him yet. The question raises is, why are activists trespassing on farms? What is it that they're hoping to accomplish? And I would say, from having spoken with many of them, there's real frustration about the state of our animal protection laws as they pertain to farms in Canada, specifically the fact that animal farming simply isn't regulated with respect to animal welfare. There's no legally binding standards at the federal or provincial levels that say, here's how much space animals must have, here's what you have to feed them, here's the types of social opportunities they should have, here's the procedures you can and cannot do to them. So there's a frustration there that the industry polices itself. And many activists have vowed to continue this type of activism because they believe it's an effective way of exposing conditions on farms. And just to put this in context, we're talking in 2019 about 834 million animals kept on farms, which is a huge number that keeps going up. You can see in 2015, only a few years ago, it was closer to 750 million. So it is a drastic increase, and people are rightfully concerned about what's happening. Sort of in the lead up to Canada's Ag Gag laws being introduced, this is some images from a very high profile event called Meet the Victims in British Columbia, where activists entered onto a pig farm and performed a lockdown where they essentially stayed inside the barn for a period of time. And some of them were arrested, they were eventually removed, but the footage was disturbing and there was a lot of high profile media attention. The last sort of significant action like this before Ag Gag laws hit was a liberation lockdown, quote, in southern Alberta, where activists descended onto a turkey farm and engaged in a similar process where they alerted the media and locked themselves down for a period of time to make the point that the turkeys were not faring well on that farm. So not long after that, we see the first Canadian Ag Gag statute introduced. So that was Bill 27 in Alberta. It was introduced in mid-November and it passed in only 10 days with almost no debate. And what this legislation does is a little bit different from some of the US statutes. The Ag Gag statutes are all unique. They sort of take bits and pieces from each other. But it amends trespass statutes in Alberta, and it prohibits entry onto property without permission. Now, this is not just farms. This is any type of property that someone doesn't give you permission to be on. And what it says that turns it, so just backing up for a second, entry onto property without permission, that's already an offense. It's called trespass. That's what we have, trespass statutes. But what's new about this piece of legislation in Alberta is it says that a person who obtains consent to be on property by false pretenses is deemed to have entered the land without permission. And that person could be hit with a pretty hefty fine of up to $10,000 for a first offense, $25,000 for a second offense. And this is very significant, up to $200,000 for a corporation. That includes a nonprofit or a charity. Now, false pretenses is important because when you think about how undercover investigations are done, and there have been a number in Alberta, including at a hog exchange and a couple of egg farms, what that involves is somebody applying for a job without disclosing that they might film animal cruelty if they witness it in that location. And that could potentially be considered to be false pretenses. The farmer might not have the proper understanding of why a person is there, and so they could run afoul of this law. Now, it's important that this doesn't apply just to farms. This could apply to properties like puppy mills where dogs are being raised in poor conditions. It could apply to exotic animal farmers. And it could also apply to non-animal contexts like daycare centers, or very importantly, in the midst of the crisis that we're now in, nursing homes as well. So you can see why this could be a problem, not just for animal rights advocates, but for other people too. Not long after, Ontario introduced its own trespass legislation, own Ag Gag legislation. It introduced Bill 156, and the government describes this bill as trying to protect farm animals, paradoxically, from risks that include exposing farm animals to disease and stress, as well as the risk of introducing contaminants into the food supply. So it's important to think about the way the government has communicated about this legislation. They're not calling it Ag Gag themselves. They're not saying this is to keep the activists out. They're saying two main things. Number one, biosecurity, protect animals from contracting diseases that might be carried or transmitted. And number two, protecting people's private property. So they've been very cautious, and I think they've learned lessons from the US experience, where judges have quoted from legislators who have said, this is about keeping those vegetarians out of our barns. Bill 156 sets up what's called, ironically, animal protection zones in farms and slaughterhouses, and prohibits entry into those zones. So those are zones where animals are being used. Important to note, the bill directly discusses farms and slaughterhouses, but it also provides itself with an ability, provides the government rather, with an ability to add other premises to that list of animal protection zones. And if the government chooses to do so, if this legislation passes, that could include things like zoos, that could include things like research labs, that could be a blanket ban on animal use facilities. So no entry into these zones, no interaction with animals in those zones without the consent of a farmer, and no stopping or interfering with a vehicle shipping farmed animals or interacting with those animals in the vehicle without consent. So that obviously is designed to capture the situation of someone like Anita Crines, who was giving water to a thirsty pig in distress on a very hot day. That wasn't a criminal offense, and clearly the farm community wanted it to be some sort of offense so she could be more effectively prosecuted. And again, we have a provision in this Ag Gag bill that says that consent is invalid if obtained using duress or under false pretenses. So again, that's the specific provision that is of concern for undercover investigators. Ontario's Bill 156 also grants quite sweeping arrest and private prosecution powers to farmers and truckers. And it has quite high penalties as well as restitution provisions and a cost recovery provision for a private prosecution. So if the state doesn't want to or can't prosecute and a farmer does so themselves, they can recover not only a fine or other restitution, they can also recover all of their legal costs that they spent to prosecute that person. This is pretty rare and highly unusual to see. And then just briefly, the other provinces that are considering Ag Gag measures right now: in British Columbia, there's Bill 227. It's much more narrow and much less concerning. It makes it an additional offense to contaminate a farm or slaughterhouse while trespassing. And it does have pretty high penalties of up to $10,000, $25,000, or even $50,000 in some cases. Federally, we saw conservative agriculture critic John Barlow introduce an Ag Gag bill, Bill C-205, on February 18th. And his bill, again, it's much less concerning than Ontario or Alberta's bill. It makes it an offense to enter a building where doing so could expose animals to a disease or toxic substance that is capable of affecting or contaminating them. So that doesn't necessarily preclude undercover investigations, which I think is important, but it does have pretty significant penalties. Manitoba is considering something that may end up looking like Ag Gag legislation. In mandate letters to ministers, the premier asked them to look at farm trespass laws. We wrote to the government to ask what they planned and advise them that Ag Gag legislation could be unconstitutional. They have promised to continue consulting, but this is an excerpt from the letter that they have sent back to us, stating that they are concerned about the risks apparently involved with on-farm activism. And there's a commitment to moving something forward, potentially in the fall. Who knows right now with the COVID situation. And Quebec has struck, for those of you who can't read French, let me just explain that Quebec has struck a special committee to look at farm trespass legislation. This article in La Presse actually mentions that this could potentially apply to restaurants, as in addition to slaughterhouses and farms. So we'll see what's to come from Quebec. Now, the concern over Ag Gag legislation and what one might see next is legal challenges to it. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms enshrines everyone's freedom of belief, opinion, and expression in those rights stuck in the Charter. This includes freedom to express oneself especially about matters of political importance, which absolutely includes animals. And the way that these Ag Gag bills probably contravene freedom of expression is by preventing people from going onto farms and gathering that information through an undercover expose or through a whistleblowing employee. So if an employee is forced to disclose information by a government law that they don't wish to disclose, that could likely be a problem. Now, the real question, in my view, is going to be whether that is a justifiable restriction on people's freedom of speech. You can abridge charter rights if there's a good reason to do so, but the government has to justify that, and I'm not certain that it's going to be able to come up with a strong justification at this particular moment. It is focused on biosecurity, but there's an argument that biosecurity, particularly in the wake of the pandemic that we're in right now, it's all the more important to be able to see what's happening inside farms, because we know that animal agriculture is responsible for viruses and other contaminants that make us sick and affect human health. I would just say that that's not just my opinion, that's the opinion of dozens of Canadian law professors and leading constitutional and criminal law experts who sent a letter to the Ontario government saying that its Ag Gag legislation would likely be found unconstitutional because it infringes people's freedom of expression. So I will wrap things up there, and I'm sure if there's more to get into, we can do so in the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Camille, for breaking down so quickly a complex number of issues. It gets to boggle the mind a little bit just how many different ways these pieces of legislation could impact not only animal activism, but also many different sectors across the board. And actually one question that just came up right now, and I'm gonna ask it because it seems appropriate to that, which is, somebody asked, if society is for transparency with regards to vulnerable humans, such as seniors and children, why would we not want this for animals who are just as, if not more, vulnerable? It's a big question, and I think I'll just put it out to the floor and see who would like to answer that question.
Well, I have a lot to say about that. I think as our circle of compassion widens, that's absolutely the direction that people are moving in. I mean, before so many undercover exposés started coming out, I think that many people were very much in the dark about the situation on farms, and that veil has been lifted. And I think we're starting to see increasing calls for transparency and a public that's just increasingly less accepting of the status quo, where animals are kept behind closed doors and there aren't any government inspections and no public oversight of these situations. So that's why we've seen, I think, in other countries, calls even for cameras inside slaughterhouses and farms to live stream to the internet so that the public can have some confidence that the animals in our food system aren't being viciously abused. And, I think the more the industry tries to resist transparency, as Nina's research has very much shown us, I think ultimately that's going to end up being a bad move.
I absolutely agree. I think transparency is something that society in general, it's not just in agriculture, it's in everything. We're looking for increased transparency, and particularly where our food comes from. I do recognize that, a lot of the undercover videos are not representative of what goes on every single farm. And I think, as we debate these issues, we need to also recognize that nobody condones blatant animal cruelty. Absolutely. I think in generally society, we don't. Of course, there's lots of ways that we care for animals now that probably don't resonate completely with societal values. And in agriculture, we must accept that and work towards improving the lives of those animals. And it really comes down to being open dialogue and engaging and having the courage to engage in conversation about some of the difficult tasks. And that's what I think makes this and so many of the things really challenging for everybody, is we all have our values that we walk into these conversations with, and we need to embrace those differences and find common ground. And only through conversations will we be able to find common ground. And this is where I guess personally I don't agree with the Ag Gag log, because I think by putting up a 3-foot fence, we are basically saying we're not interested in having conversations. Anyways, it's my 2 bits on that.
Well, and I think that's very interesting, Nina. It's certainly a piece of what I've been trying to communicate as well, is that the introduction of Ag Gag into Canada has really created polarization once again within, between lots of different groups. And it's unfortunate because it's actually stalling other important work that could be moving forward. We're getting questions fast and furious now. It was quiet for a bit there and I was wondering why, but here's one question that perhaps either Kevin or Camille want to answer from a legal perspective. It says, can you elaborate more on the ramifications for workers or veterinary professionals that what they might face when witnessing violations on farm? Does Ag Gag impact their ability to either be a whistleblower or to report?
In the American context, there are elements of certain state Ag Gag legislation that would have an impact on whistleblowers, which is one of the reasons why that type of Ag Gag in the US is being struck down, because the courts found that that was not appropriate or constitutional. I guess depending on how Ag Gag is both drafted and then interpreted by the courts, there could be impacts on whistleblowers. But in the jurisdictions in the US that I took a look at, if it was something that would have an impact on whistleblowers, it was found to be unconstitutional.
Thanks, Kevin. Someone asked, are there any farm groups that have been vocal about opposing this legislation? Does anyone know of that? Oh, Nina, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry. I can just say, so I do a lot of public speaking to farm groups, and I was, I guess it was last fall, I was in Idaho, and I presented some of this in a longer talk, but I presented a bit of this work, and it was interesting. I mean, these were farmers and veterinarians working in the heartland of agriculture who definitely conveyed to me the best thing that Idaho did was back off on the Ag Gag. It was really interesting how they were very proud of the fact that at least their state decided to roll back a little bit.
Great, thank you, Nina. Here's an interesting question. Is there a middle ground to be found to establish that information found or recorded should only be released in raw footage? Would that prevent this idea that there's bias in editing? Would it alleviate some of the opposition to these laws? And I might just back that lens out a bit and just say, is there a middle ground? Is there a way that animals can be better protected, consumers can be confident, and farmers can feel secure?
Well, I would say that, you know, the middle ground, just given as an example, requiring footage to be released in its entirety, for instance, would likely be unconstitutional as well, because that would be a form of coerced expression. You know, interestingly, in some states, what Ag Gag laws have contained is a requirement to report abuse right away if it's witnessed. So if an undercover employee sees abuse, they must report it within 24 hours. And that's something that was kind of billed as a middle ground. But what it ended up doing was blowing that employee's cover and an opportunity to stay longer and see what's really happening on farms and whether management in particular is complicit in that. So, you know, my personal view is that you know, the balance of power is already so far weighted in the direction of the farmers. They have, I mean, just, you know, one commodity group, the Dairy Farmers of Canada alone, has an $80 million marketing budget. That's more than all the animal rights groups in Canada combined by a factor of many. So, you know, I think with Ag Gag, if we're looking at watering down people's charter rights and getting ourselves into a situation where there's going to be less transparency, that there should be no watering down of our charter rights.
So one of the things that strikes me is as a type of middle ground is, rather than focusing on the individuals who are attempting to improve animal welfare, is to simply improve animal welfare. So Canada's animal welfare or animal protection statutes are overwhelmingly antiquated, ineffective, and rarely and poorly prosecuted due to funding inadequacies. If the governments spend as much time focusing on fixing those issues as they did targeting the still relatively small number of people who engage in this kind of conduct, I think that would really change the discussion in a positive direction. So focus on animal welfare rather than those who are trying to improve it.
I think just the other thing from a lot of the social science work that we've done, I mean, animal welfare exists because society's asking questions. And I think agriculture has to listen to the fact that society's asking questions about some of the ways that we care for animals. But, you know, what's also, what I've also seen in a lot of the work that we've been doing, and we see this in Europe, is that, you know, the thoughtful person on the street expects that agriculture tries to get better every day. They don't expect that agriculture turn itself on its head and do a transformational change in 24 hours. These are nuanced, you know, thoughtful people. What agriculture has to do is try to get better every day. And that will include things, you know, and there's lots of things that agriculture is doing through the codes of practice, but it's, you know, we can't just do one little change and say that we've done enough. We're learning every day. We got to try and get better every day in order to think, really, at the end of the day, what we all want is that these animals have reasonably good lives. And that, I think, what you know, and so that's going to take science, that's going to take will, that's going to take everybody together.
Those are great comments to wrap up on, and we are coming towards the end of our time together, and fruitful conversation happening. I definitely agree that we should fix our animal welfare laws. We should fix our enforcement frameworks, which are also to be holding some of the responsibility here, that we're not having strong enforcement out of CFIA, for example, to ensure that the laws we do have are being enforced. But greater transparency has always been a better process in order to make change. And I think we shouldn't water down our charter freedoms. Of course, those are critically important in order to backstop the other weaknesses. I'd like to give each of you an opportunity just to say a few closing words, not too long, but if you want to just wrap up with any closing thoughts. Camille, we'll start with you if you'd like.
Sure, thanks, Barbara. I would just say that I think the meat industry is at a crossroads right now, and the pandemic is driving all of this to a head. People are increasingly concerned about stories of mass worker infection inside slaughterhouses, especially slaughterhouses in Alberta, which of course, because there's now Ag Gag laws, are less focused and able to be transparent than ever before. I think people are concerned about the math, euthanasia, depopulation, culling, whatever you want to call it, it's killing off farmed animals. And when people hear about this, they are increasingly thinking about moving away from the meat industry, moving away from consuming products of an industry that's proven itself not to be transparent. And, I think if there's one benefit that we're seeing from the introduction of these Ag Gag laws, it's that conversation is happening. People are asking, what are you trying to hide? And the answer is out there for anyone who goes to Google and types in factory farm undercover investigation. So we'll see where this goes. I don't think this is at the end of the conversation. The more that these laws are pushed, the more that there's going to be opposition, and the more that there's going to be legal challenges. And ultimately, that's at least good for public discussion.
Thanks, Camille. Nina, do you have a few final thoughts for us? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, just to say thank you again to Humane Canada for starting the conversation somewhere. This is an area that needs discussion, and it's going to be tough discussions, but we've got to be willing to engage.
Thank you, Nina. Kevin, do you have a final thought for us?
When governments are challenged in the US to prove that the biosecurity concerns are actually motivating the legislation that is being advanced, they typically fail and the courts reject the allegation that it's biosecurity that's driving this legislation. So I think even if Canadian politicians call it something else, say it has some other purpose, when they're actually put to the task, they will likely fail and it will be exposed for what it really is, targeting those that are trying to improve animal welfare rather than just trying to make lives of animals better in the first place.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you once again. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Kevin, for spending this hour with us, for boiling down some fairly complex information into really bite-sized, digestible chunks that people can take away. We get a lot of questions at Humane Canada. What is it? Why is it a problem? Should I be worried? And I think I'm going to point them all right to this presentation every time because it really lays it out crystal clear. I appreciate your time and your thoughts. I look forward to continuing this conversation. I agree that this is really just the beginning and we need to engage further and have more of these types of conversations and have more stakeholders at the table so that we can find that common ground. Thank you once again and enjoy the rest of the conference.